Russia has the advantage at the moment on the battlefield in Ukraine. And Ukraine enters this year, 2024, it's now going to be the third year of the Russian full-scale invasion, in a far more perilous place than it has been really at any time since after the first few weeks of the initial invasion in February 2022.
We sort of want to do a sort of comparison to sort of the situation in Ukraine now versus what it was 2 years ago. So for you, what is the biggest thing to have changed in the conflict from that initial Russian invasion 2 years ago to now?
So the Russian invasion began February the 24th, 2022. And in the months following that, right up until the first year anniversary, there were a number of key Ukrainian victories. First of all, Ukraine really seized the information space, galvanized the imagination of the Western world, and proved to the Western world that they were not going to collapse in the first few days, as had been anticipated in the face of the Russian invasion. Moreover, in the subsequent months, they garnered three key victories. They broke the Russian advance on Kyiv. Russians withdrew from Kyiv. And then later in the summer, there was this dramatic Ukrainian counteroffensive in the territory east of Kharkiv, which took back a huge amount of territory which had earlier been captured by the Russians, Ukrainian territory earlier captured by the Russians. And then later in the year, in November, Ukrainian troops successfully managed to liberate the city of Kherson. So right up until the first anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, really you have a number of key strategic victories, some on the territory, some in the information space, for the Ukrainians. But if you look back now over the second year of war, as we go to the second anniversary this week, actually there's been a change in the scales of fortune, and Ukraine is looking back this year on some key defeats. It's looking on the loss of Bakhmut in May last year to the Russians, and with that, the cream, some of the cream of the Ukrainian army destroyed. Many people would say needlessly in defending a town that might not have been of strategic importance against a convict army, the Russian Wagner Group's convict army. Then you would have had not just the failure, but actually the defeat of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer. And that was a defeat. It was blocked very efficiently by Russian defensive lines, ground down, fragmented, and ceased. And that might have been the Ukrainians' best chance to really regain battlefield initiative. And then finally, this year, you've had the loss of Avdiivka, which is an important Donbass town. It opens up gateway to further advances along key communication lines elsewhere in the Donbass. So this year we're looking on the battlefield, not at Ukrainian victories, but at some harsh defeats. And overall, in terms of the strategic nature of the war, we're also looking at some real challenges to Ukraine. A lot of challenges from the external situation amongst the support of allies, other challenges by, the renovation and revitalization of Russian forces, which has been extremely dramatic particularly over the last year. Russians learned from the egregious mistakes of 2022 and done a really successful refit and regeneration of its army. And I think, thirdly, internally, there's some really big questions for Ukraine to answer politically and militarily, primarily to do with the size of its army, its mobilization.
And you mentioned in your answer there about the sort of beginning of this war, this like sort of galvanizing of Ukrainian troops, and we were told like this unbelievable morale that Ukraine had. In terms of the morale from the soldiers, has that changed in the last 2 years?
Yes, it has changed. The Russian troops invading Ukraine 2 years ago clashed first of all with Ukrainian regular forces, and then very quickly with volunteer units. Thousands and thousands of Ukrainians volunteered to fight against the Russians. Now, by and large, the original regular Ukrainian army has been degraded to so much by casualties, both dead and wounded, that it is, barely in existence anymore. It has been completely complemented by a tranche of people, thousands of guys who volunteered. But that volunteer force, very similar to the First World War here, you had the original British Expeditionary Force, Then you had volunteers, Kitchener's army. Then you had finally mobilized guys. Now we're now into the mobilized era. This army, Ukraine's army, is largely a mobilized force. Now these are men. The average age is 43, because in terms of mobilization, guys aren't mobilized under the age of 27 and sent off to the front. So they're a much older force. The degradations of the battlefield are much harsher on men in their 40s. Their training is quite questionable, the amount of training they get. Their casualty rates are astronomical. I mean, I don't think many listeners have the idea quite of the nature of the carnage going on the Eastern Front at the moment. And morale is much more questionable, even though the majority of people in Ukraine believe totally in the right of their defensive war against Russian aggression. Actually, in translating that to committing soldiers, particularly young soldiers, to the front lines in the east, we are seeing big question marks, and we're seeing mobilized units having problems in going into the attack, mobilization with morale going in on the attack, and we're having a huge reluctance in Ukrainian society to lower the age of mobilization to incorporate its 18 to 27-year-olds, young men who arguably would be far more effective fighters due to their physical prowess and youth than people over the age of 27. But Ukrainian society doesn't want to commit its youth to the fight.
And you spent a lot of time in Ukraine with Ukrainian troops for the Times. What sort of one moment or one story that really sticks out in your mind of the last 2 years?
There are quite a lot of moments there. I remember, I think I was working with the Times team, who were one of the last journalists, if not exactly the last, one of the last, into the city of Bakhmut as Russian forces were closing in upon it. And there was a horrible road down the hill into Bakhmut. By that stage, the Russians were really in on the edge of the city. And as so often in a modern battlefield or an urban battlefield, the first thing you notice is there's nobody there. It's just empty. So all the soldiers are either in bunkers beneath ground or in hiding up in buildings. And an enduring image is, as we came down to the bottom of the hill, and it's not a road you can drive fast on. It's kind of rutted by shells and all the rest of it. And the shell fire impacting into this city ahead of us. At the bottom, we had to really slow down, and there was a Ukrainian military vehicle which had been hit by a shell. The driver was there and was on fire in the vehicle. That was quite an enduring memory. Obviously, we had to slow down because you couldn't rush past it. So we were bumping past this vehicle right beside us with this soldier ablaze in it at about 15 miles an hour. So there was no avoiding his fate. And it's a pretty horrible sight. That kind of stays with me a bit.
And this question might be quite difficult for you to answer, but if you could possibly put into percentage the chances of Ukraine winning the war, considering where we are at the moment, how are you feeling about Ukraine's chances?
It's impossible. I'll tell you, not only can I not answer that, but I shouldn't attempt to try and answer that, because war is not governed by the known parameters of the percentages. War is ruled by many things, known and unknown, and that's not being evasive. The dynamic of chaos, and I always say this is great I love this phrase because it's so true. The dynamic of chaos permeates war. There are things which happen in war that you can't aim off for. And so much of this war as well is governed not just by what's going on the battlefield, but by outside agencies, by the supplies of, for example, Russia's relationship with Iran and Korea, which suddenly it's benefited to the tune of 1 million artillery shells due to its relationships with North Korea, the vagaries of American support, the wobbly nature of NATO support. Those are things which you can't quite predict how that's going to work out for Ukraine. But what I can say with certainty is that Russia has the advantage at the moment on the battlefield in Ukraine. And Ukraine enters this year, 2024, it's now going to be the third year of the Russian full-scale invasion, in a far more perilous place than it has been really at any time since after the first few weeks of the initial invasion in February 2022.
And my final question, Anthony, you kind of alluded to it throughout the whole piece, but from a Ukrainian perspective and from sort of boots on the ground and from the ground perspective, how important is the US election this year to those troops and to the Ukrainian army?
Well, I think there's two elements to that. First of all, there is no doubt Ukraine cannot sustain itself in fighting Russia unless it has Western support. Full stop. It cannot do that. It will be overwhelmed unless it has Western support. Now, ideally, of course, everybody wants the $60 billion aid package, or the current support package, which is being held up at the House of Representatives, to go to Ukraine. But in the longer term, that's not going to end the war somehow. It's going to sustain Ukraine for a length of time. And in that length of time, perhaps it might be possible for it to degrade Russian forces so much that a negotiated settlement becomes more possible. But it doesn't guarantee an outcome. But further to that, I think it's important to challenge the assumption that the US should somehow be primarily responsible for funding Ukraine, for supporting Ukraine in this war. NATO has to take its responsibilities, and at the moment, America funds NATO disproportionately in this age, or on a kind of funding template line, which was defined very much in the 50s, post-Second World War, when Europe was entirely crippled by its experience of the Second World War and couldn't properly defend itself against the threat of Russia. That relationship, that proportion and balance of funding does have to be redefined by NATO if it wants to respond to what it sees as the Russian threat and the Russian challenges coming from the East. And by that, I mean that it is as much beholden to Europe and to NATO to support Ukraine if it wishes Ukraine to be victorious in this war, or have the chance of victory in this war, as it is to the US.